So I'd like to start thinking together with all of you about Queens in New York, one of the most socially diverse places on the planet. And while this is ostensibly a book talk, because I have this book, Global Queens, my goal here is really to put some stakes in the ground, right? And to talk about why this project matters, to me at least. What are the larger issues to which this book speaks? Why should we pay such close attention to diverse urban spaces and places like Queens? That's why. So my remarks today are really motivated by urgent matters of politics in an age of Trumpism and Brexit. Because whether Trump wins or loses the election in November, his legacy of belligerence, anti-immigrant hostility, and white racial revanchism lives on in the constituencies that he's cultivated. The same constituencies that stormed the Capitol in a dangerous but ultimately failed attempt to overturn the election results and to reinstall Trump as their leader. And while Brexit in the UK itself is a done deal, the xenophobic forces that pried open the fissure between the United Kingdom and the continent continue to threaten the very project of Europe with dissolution. And amid these revanchist politics, what I want to do is offer a contrary plea for a politics grounded in diversity, plural societies, and expansive notions of citizenship, and the possibility of a cosmopolitan vision. Over the course of the past few decades, planetary migration streams loosed by economic deprivation, regional wars, and globalization have catapulted questions about diversity and tolerance to the forefront of political debate. In the US, the wave of xenophobia that emerged after 9/11 and that culminated in the election of Trump to the presidency reflects a deep moral panic over the meaning of citizenship and the boundaries of culture and belonging in a rapidly changing world. Police continue to murder Black men and women with impunity, confident in their insulation from punishment. Pro-Trump marches slide effortlessly into attacks on immigrants and people of color. Hateful rhetoric and actions have increased across the U.S., perpetrated against Jewish, Muslim, and BIPOC communities as a kind of hyperventilation of the white Christian body politic, challenged with the loss of primacy. In this sense, the near frantic obsession among Trump supporters to finish the wall is less a practical solution to the flow of undocumented people than it is a symbol of white racial revanchism. The deliberate demand to build a massive barrier along the U.S.-Mexico border to round up undocumented people and hold them in detention centers conjures hallucinatory enemies whose very presence seems to threaten the racial order. Meanwhile, terrorist attacks by so-called Islamists in Paris, Berlin, London, Madrid, and Istanbul not only result in deaths, but in unsettled nerves and profound social dis-ease as people adjust to conditions of fear and distrust. The growing refugee crisis across the Middle East and Europe unleashed yet more waves of xenophobic hostility, shaping the outcomes of elections in Germany, France, Austria, Hungary, and the Netherlands, each turning crucially on the question of multiculturalism, immigration, and citizenship. And while mutually reinforcing, this continual dance between incendiary violence and reactionary politics has provoked widespread soul-searching about the role of tolerance in nominally democratic societies. So as these dark clouds roll over our world, we have to begin to ask ourselves very basic questions about how we're going to live with each other in the 21st century. What human modes of togetherness are possible in what seems to be an increasingly illiberal political landscape? With over half of the world's population now resulting in urbanized areas, and with the limitations of the nation state as a secure, stable framework for citizenship, the answer to this question, I would argue, lies, to a large extent, in our cities. It is in our cities, amid the bustling streets, sidewalks, shops, markets, parks, and playgrounds, that large numbers of people encounter one another across lines of difference. And it is out of the multiplication of such encounters that we might hope, at least, that new social forms arise to reshape the terms of life in an increasingly global age. So my book, Global Queens, is part of a longer-term project that I really kind of call loosely Laboratories of the Next City, right? And in this project, I'm looking for these manifold spaces of encounter between people and the people who inhabit and shape these spaces in the context of urban neighborhoods remade by immigration over the last century. And while drawing on demographic data and life course narratives, interviews, fieldwork, that sort of thing, the project makes primary use of documentary photographic methods to bring emergent spatial and social realities of the city into relief. The central focus of this longer-term project is a search for what I call the cosmopolis, or perhaps more accurately, the possibilities for cosmopolis. And here I'm using the term cosmopolis to signal an urban condition or way of life that arcs towards tolerance and that derives social benefits from elevated degrees of human diversity. However, this is not the abstract tolerance of Locke or Rousseau, ennobled in philosophy and codified in law, though these are important to the story, nor is it the bland, bloodless multiculturalism of 1990s educational textbooks and corporate cant. Rather, it's the rough, multi-textured, always incomplete tolerance achieved through constant negotiation between diverse groups in the ordinary course of social relations. What scholars such as Fuyaki Kurosawa and Ajahn Appadurai have called a cosmopolitanism from below. It is a search for meaning in what the great urbanist Abdul Malik Simone describes as the intricate details of people's lives. And not just one meaning, but an assemblage of meanings, multiple trajectories of traveling, inhabiting, and relating to one another across lines of difference. After all, as literary theorist Ursula Herza put it, we are talking about performative and relational connections forged in the breach among people, hearts that beat in multiple places. For it's the precondition of building a new world, if the precondition, of building a new world is transnational solidarity, that is solidarity across national borders, then the precondition of transnational solidarity is precisely this cosmopolitanism from below, forged in the fugitive folds and spaces of great cities. A next city, already present, a next city researched and developed by immigrants and working class people in the ordinary practice of getting by. And so in the neighborhoods and communities around the world, the next city wells up as an unfinished proposition, an urban world continually in the making, weaving together the threads of human diversity, changing landscapes, and multiform aspirations. Ordinary people are remaking the city through daily interactions and adaptations, both to their new conditions and to one another. Sometimes these adaptations arise out of the vernacular of custom and habits of the heart. Other times from the swirl of people in motion and the rush of new ideas, avatars, and possibilities of being in a digitally driven, fiber optically connected world. Occasionally, groups coalesce into more determined collectivities, such as immigrant rights groups, nonprofit organizations, refugee resettlement agencies, political clubs, business networks, and other institutions of civil society. In all cases, such efforts reflect the intense work undertaken by people to create functional and pleasurable and meaningful spaces, and ultimately to change the very sense of the city itself to include their presence. These days, much of the attention among architects, planners, urban designers, and scholars of globalization is focused on its talismans, a scripted indexical suite of grand projects. This is the realm of starchitecture, of large design, engineering, and construction firms spanning the globe to provide capital with its spatial fix. We are captivated, really mesmerized, by the spectacular futurist propositions of Masdar City, the mushrooming towers of Shenzhen, the worlding power of the London Olympic grounds, and the post-human promise of hyper-smart Songdo in Korea. And why not? They are designed to capture our attention, to dumbfound us with their futurity. Such developments are tied together not only through global financial performance requirements, but through the adventures of a diverse, jet-setting, early adopting high-tech elite. This footloose stratum of designers, consultants, sales reps, software engineers, brand managers, and apostles of the creative class crisscross the planet selling the sizzle of global identity. Indeed, as an ensemble in perpetual motion, they underscore the cliche of cosmopolitanism as the province of a canny cultural elite, the airportariat, the Ritzoisie, the limousine lumpen, right? And yet, with all that said, I would submit that it's really in the archipelago of diverse urban neighborhoods wedged into our great cities where the different mobilities are being forged. This comprises, in my mind, the nucleus of the emergent cosmopolis. Often it's where the workers who build the spectacular landscapes actually live, eat, pray, love, and do business. Such neighborhoods provide the space for, indeed, the very possibility of negotiation, multilateral conflict, and contingent resolution on the street. In the tense interstitial nodes between older and emerging urban forms, ordinary people experiment, take risks, and imagine possibilities for the future. And it's in these roiling locales that new social contracts take shape, new concepts of citizenship and belonging obtain, new values of coexistence come into view. Now, such processes are not without structural and personal violence. I'm not talking about a happy and carefree world here. Sometimes barely contained ethnic and religious conflicts erupt into riots or even civil war. Beirut during the 1980s, Bujumbura in the 1990s, Mosul in the 2000s, Aleppo today. Even in the very best of times, diversity itself is not an unalloyed good, right? It often reflects countless trajectories of pain and trauma, people forced to leave home for political or economic reasons, washed up on strange shores, desperate to find a foothold in new lands. To an outsider, right, the urban neighborhoods transformed by these flows might appear like the pleasurable symphony of human social multiplicity playing out in the daily ballet of the street, right? But to a resident, to someone who's made these sojourns, such diversity might feel like the unintended or incidental outcome of a heartbreaking sojourn to new lands, the subsequent competition for cheap housing, the endless hustle to make a living. It might reflect affordable business opportunities in marginal locations, or the hunger for religious home place and kinship networks. That is the creation of these socially diverse communities. The question must always be asked: if diversity is a social good, then for whom? Right? How are these diverse cultural groups arrayed socially, economically, and politically? How equal are they in terms of rights and resources? What wages does diversity pay into the pockets of those inscribed with the lineaments of difference? Still, diverse urban neighborhoods play a mitigating role by enabling varied groups to build safe havens from which to stake claims on the city. While global financial and political institutions shape the broad contours of urbanism, the central experience on the level of the street is the shifting cast of characters wrought through diasporic flows. Amid the everyday cacophony of city life, immigrant communities negotiate new urban conditions, carve out felicitous social and religious spaces, and establish resident institutions to advance their interests. They adapt existing built environments and alter the uses of particular spaces to suit their needs. They are constantly compelled to work through conflicts not only with each other, but also with the dominant culture and political apparatus of the host nation. In the process of girding their everyday lives and building collectivities, these groups offer crucial lessons for the future of the city, for getting along in a globalizing age. The result is an emerging cosmopolis, not a brittle doctrine imposed from above, but an open, flexible, agonistic, and ever-changing set of relations that blur social boundaries, and that call forth new modes of togetherness. So the project that I've been engaged in, as I said, these past few years, this broader project of which the Queen's Book is a part, examines these kind of relationships in hyperdiverse or super diverse neighborhoods in several countries. Now, the term hyperdiverse, I'm using a particular way here. It's often used by scholars of social research, sociologists, for example, to indicate a sociospatial condition where multiple ethnic, national, and linguistic groups cohabitate, but where none dominate as a numerical majority. It is a condition of plural potentialities, often braided together despite the hostilities and inequalities proffered by the host society. Now, the neighborhoods that I've been looking at and am interested in or want to expand into include several, and I'll just go tell you briefly what the neighborhoods are. One of the neighborhoods is Saint-Gilles in Brussels, which you see here. I don't know if people are familiar with Saint-Gilles. It's a very diverse part of Brussels. You can just see, even just from the city council elections, I think this was 2019 or 2018. It just a really super diverse constituencies mobilizing in the political sphere in Saint-Gilles. Markham and Scarborough and Toronto. Anyone from Canada here? No. These are also really diverse communities. Toronto is, like New York, one of the most diverse cities, socially diverse cities in the world. London, Toronto, New York, Los Angeles. So Markham is a really important, it's a suburb, but has grown to be the most diverse part of the Toronto metropolitan area. San Telmo in Buenos Aires. Anyone been to San Telmo? Really lovely, lovely community, really interesting history of kind of diverse groups having to sort of learn to live with each other, Armenians and Greeks, Russian and German Jews, a really kind of a long history of immigration to that neighborhood. Peckham in London, in South London, although this is an interesting story, since I began tracing Peckham, it has become less diverse, less socially diverse as gentrification takes over. As gentrification takes over, it's increasingly the kind of immigrant communities are being priced out of the neighborhood. So it looks very different today than I started studying it. So if I want to actually study really diverse parts of London, you actually have to go really further and further outside of the boundaries of the metropolis. Jackson Heights and Elmhurst in Queens in New York, which I'll talk about later today. And Belleville and the Goutte d'Or in Paris, which I'll also talk a little bit more about. But before we take a more detailed look at some of these neighborhoods, what I'd like to do right now is to step back for a second and really talk about matters of photography and the photographic work that I've done and how I kind of conceptualize it. So the mode of image making for this project emerges out of the tradition of documentary photography. But like many contemporary practitioners, I'm really troubled by the conventions, tropes, and traditional uses of the image in documentary photography, rooted as they are in a clutch of humanist epistemological conceits, such as the notion of photography as a truth-telling device. Documentary photography, of course, has a long-standing relationship with urban social research. Progressive era reformers in the 19th and early 20th centuries, such as Jacob Riis, Lewis Hine, and Alice C. Harris, used photographs to depict the social ills of tenements, factories, and colonialism, respectively. Despite their often highly problematic visual rhetoric, they did inspire a generation of sociologists, urban planners, and activists to deploy photography as a tool of social activism and reform. So that when you get into the 1930s, the U.S. government hired leading photographers to document the impact of the Great Depression and the efforts of federal agencies to ameliorate the plight and suffering of people across the country. They sent into the field such remarkable talent as Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, Russell Lee, Gordon Parks, Marion Post Walcott. There's a real collection of incredible talent. But beginning in the 1950s, this began to change a bit. critiques of documentary photography really arose both from social theorists and from photographers themselves. And many of them were influenced by the photographer Robert Frank and his sort of landmark book in 1959, The Americans, right, in which mundane, claustrophobically composed personal scenes greatly redacted the narrative scope and documentary license of the photograph. Quite similarly, in the United Kingdom, the work of Paul Trevor and the Exit Photography Group in the 1960s and 1970s, which I've also studied, explored photography's affective capacities, rooted not so much in intact subjects, but in partial obscurances, bodily stances, kinesthetic gestures, and other fragmentary elements of human action and activity. And the work of the great street photographers, such as Vivian Maier, and again, Gordon Parks, who's kind of great at everything he does, and Ara Guler, whose images you see here, these three photographers, they revealed how the image can simultaneously evoke and also foreclose ready-made narratives, acting at once as visual prosthesis of collective memory, and at the same time as instigators of stories that are unheralded and untold, right? So a lot of ambiguity in the photography of these practitioners. Meanwhile, in this period, the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, theorists such as Alan Sekula and Susan Sontag began to unravel the status of photography's truth claims, seeing instead a medium intersected and shaped by multiple discourses. So artists such as Martha Rossler, who you see on the left, who's also my New School colleague, and Gary Winograd, who you see on the right, further destabilized the relationship between the photograph and the subject, questioning the very possibility of the medium as a truth-telling device. I think fortunately, since the 1980s, there has been an emerging body of work by photographers that's carved out a space for, I think, a more theoretically informed documentary practice. And here I'm talking about the work of photographers like Nan Golden, Manuel Rivera Ortiz, Albrecht Tubke, Deirdre O'Callaghan, and Kevin W.Y. Lee. And they've really led the way in re-engaging with major social issues such as family disintegration, domestic abuse, human rights, poverty, and climate change, but in a very different kind of way, a very less direct and one-to-one corresponding way. So here we see an image from Kevin Lee's extraordinary Bay of Dreams series, which explores globalization in Singapore as a kind of fugue state induced through architectural forms and consumer imaginaries. This recent generation of photographers, I think, uses the exposure not to define social realities, but rather to explore contingent relations, liminal spaces, shifting identities, and alternate meanings. Rather than the classic humanist approach that assumes photography to be a transparent instrument of truth, as in the work of Jacob Riis or Lewis Hine, or a mode of access to depth or interiority, as in the work of Dorothea Lange or even Robert Frank, contemporary documentary exposure seeks meaning in the unstable relations between the photographer, the subject, the image, and the viewer. It's really an effort to address what media theorist Ariella Azoulay has called the civil contract of photography. So in my own work then, I frequently use images not to define social realities, but rather to query them, right? To explore contingent relations, liminal spaces, shifting identities, and alternate meanings, right? It's a way of using photography as more than just an illustration. Rather, it becomes a technique of inquiry, a research methodology. So given all that, given this history of photography and where the work that I'm doing is situated, and this kind of broader project that I'm talking about, what have I found, right, by walking in these neighborhoods, talking with residents, and making images? Since there's not nearly enough time to review all of the communities where I've been spending time and taking images, I'll say a little bit about 4 neighborhoods in particular, and hopefully draw a few tentative conclusions. The first 2 neighborhoods in this tour are located in the New York City borough of Queens and include Jackson Heights, pictured here, and Elmhurst. Ironically, Jackson Heights was originally planned as an outpost for white middle-class Anglo-Protestant families looking to escape the noisy, danger-laden, alien social landscape of Manhattan. The Queensboro Corporation, which developed the neighborhood in the early 20th century, even supplied a Protestant church and limited most apartments to 2 bedrooms, thinking that Protestants have smaller families than Catholics and Jews, right? Well, maybe that was true. I don't know. But the vagaries of the Great Depression put an end to this racialized settlement geography, and the neighborhood rapidly became home to a diverse array of second-generation immigrants, including Jewish, Polish, Greek, Russian, Cuban, and Irish families, some of whom still actually remain in the neighborhood. Then, with the passage of the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, and I can't emphasize how important that moment was in U.S. history, new waves of immigrants began moving into Jackson Heights and other parts of Middle Queens, drawn by cheap rents and available commercial opportunities. These newcomers eventually made Jackson Heights and surrounding neighborhoods the most ethnically diverse place in the United States. Today, long-settled populations of South Asian families operate businesses in the blocks near the train station, dominated primarily by Bengali merchants from both India and Bangladesh, as well as migrants from Punjab and Gujarat. And I might also say that even within those groups, there are distinct regional differences and also differences that cut across ethnic lines. Like, so within the Bengali community, there are Hindus and there are Muslims and there are Christians, right? So even within these communities, they're also diverse, right? And so it's really interesting to, the more you sort of layer in or go down into these layers of meaning, identity, group formation, the more you see how intricate and diverse these communities really are. Meanwhile, immigrants from Colombia and Ecuador began settling the neighborhood in the 1980s and 1990s, joined later by other Central and South American families from Guatemala, Peru, Uruguay, and Argentina. Jackson Heights quickly became the center of the Latino LGBTQ community in New York City, with a variety of clubs and bars lining Roosevelt Avenue. Most recently, a large wave of newcomers has entered the community of Jackson Heights and Elmhurst as well from Nepal and Tibet. And this is a classic migration story, right, of the past half century, with the first wave composed of men seeking jobs and economic opportunity. Then, once they were able to save enough money, they began to bring wives, children, siblings, and other relatives. And this is a really important space right here. This is in Jackson Heights. This is a space that has a funny name. It's called Diversity Plaza. Not sure why it needs that name, because it just is evidently diverse. But the powers that be thought to name it that. But this is a really important public space because when Nepalese and Tibetan men started coming into Jackson Heights, they were migrating alone or maybe with one other person, and this public space was really important for them to find each other. So they would meet here, and you would see more and more growing groups of Nepalese and Tibetan men gathering in this plaza to really sort of join forces, comfort one another, care for each other, really figure out the networks and systems and the politics and everything else they needed to figure out to get along in New York City. So public space is a really important function. Nepalese and Tibetan immigrants are currently passing through the same segmented labor market as their predecessors from India and Central America, working primarily as day laborers, dishwashers, cooks, and delivery drivers. Some have managed to launch their own businesses as street vendors or shopkeepers, while others have taken jobs with the city as street cleaners and parking wardens. So there is this kind of growing economic viability for the community, and families are now, you will see Tibetan and Nepalese families on the street, not just single men. Through these varied roles, newcomers encounter longer-term residents as both conduct their business in the diverse streets and shops of the neighborhood. They also encounter one another in the streets, sidewalks, playgrounds, schools, and libraries, ESL classrooms, public space of the neighborhood, as we just saw, and of course in the ubiquitous flea markets seen here. Flea markets are a big thing in New York, so everyone's there on Saturdays and Sundays. Meanwhile, just to the south of Jackson Heights lies Elmhurst, another super diverse neighborhood, but with a different mix of people. Like Jackson Heights, Elmhurst grew rapidly in the early 20th century with the extension of the elevated 7 train on Roosevelt Avenue. It also benefited from the widening and extension of the old market road called Broadway, pictured here in the photograph, which today acts as a lively center of commercial activity. Once home to a largely Irish American and Greek population, Elmhurst underwent a dramatic transformation in the 1970s and 1980s, a transformation similar to Jackson Heights, I would say, with an influx of people first from Puerto Rico. Of course, Puerto Rican people are not immigrants; they're migrants from from a territory, but also the Dominican Republic and Cuba, and later a large group, sort of a large migrant wave from Korea, the Indian subcontinent, and Central America. However, since the 1980s, Elmhurst has had a rapidly growing population of families from Hong Kong, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Most of these families cluster in blocks between Broadway Avenue and Queens Boulevard, forming a Pan-Asian community with groceries, restaurants, shops, legal offices, driving schools, and civic associations. So, for example, the monthly Indonesian Food Festival at St. James Episcopal Church has become an important venue for bringing together families from across Southeast Asia, in fact. And while sharing food is certainly one of the ways, one way of weaving cross-cultural associations, another important effect has been the rise of immigrant solidarity in the face of governmental violence and harassment. So, for example, in Jackson Heights and Elmhurst, as soon as agents from ICE, the Immigration Control and Enforcement, appear in the area to try to make arrests, multiple alerts go out across various online platforms, warning people to avoid particular streets or places so as to escape the net of the federal authorities. The second group of neighborhoods that I want to just touch on and visit in this talk includes Belleville and the Goutte d'Or in Paris. Belleville is a faubourg on the right bank, faubourg meaning kind of a neighborhood that got incorporated into the city of Paris in the 19th century. It's located to the east of the city's historic center, straddling 4 arrondissements. It enjoyed status as an autonomous commune until incorporation into the expanding city in the middle of the 19th century. Traditionally, a working-class neighborhood, Belleville also attracted refugees from the abortive 1848 revolution in Germany, as well as Jewish immigrants from the shtetls of Russia and Poland. Its cabarets and bookstores attracted bohemians, radicals, and anti-clerical Catholics and transients. Think of Edith Piaf. If there are any Edith Piaf fans out there, this is her stomping grounds where she grew up. Dissidents from Belleville played important roles in both the 1848 uprising and the Paris Commune of 1871. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the neighborhood increasingly attracted immigrants from Armenia, Lebanon, and Cyprus, particularly after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. After relative stability through the several decades of economic depression and war, that is, stability in terms of the neighborhood not turning over too much, those weren't necessarily stable times, but the neighborhood was relatively stable, it began to change again in the 1950s as migrants began to move in from Algeria, Morocco, Vietnam, and other French colonies. Most of the Vietnamese who came in, let's see, did I skip one? Yeah. Most of the Vietnamese were actually ethnic Chinese and Francophone Catholics, worried for their future after the fall of French forces at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And meanwhile, the harsh and violent treatment of North African migrants in France touched the lives of many residents of Belleville in the 1950s and 1960s. Finally, over the last few decades, new streams of migration have opened up from West Africa, primarily. While most Sierra Leoneans and Cameroonians actually moved to the Goutte d'Or, neighborhood. Quite a few have found their homes and opportunities in Belleville. And today, I would say, even with these changes, the specter of gentrification and rising housing costs have forced many migrants out of the neighborhood. So Belleville is also one of those places that is changing very rapidly, like Peckham in London that I showed you earlier. So it doesn't look a lot like it did when I first started studying Belleville, 15, 20 years ago. One sub-area of Belleville that remains stalwartly diverse, however, is the Place des Fêtes, a massive cluster of social housing tower blocks erected in the 1960s during a particularly vigorous phase of urban renewal. I spent a lot of time here over the years. Here in the towers, the plazas, the schools, and the weekly market, people encounter one another across multiple lines of difference. All those groups that I talked about before are sort of encountering each other in these spaces. Cross-cultural friendships form frequently, romances kindle, bargains are negotiated, deals are struck from day to day. Islam, of course, is a common factor for a great many of the residents in Place des Fêtes, but by no means all. Many of the West Africans and Vietnamese, for example, are Christian. And in any case, the neighborhood evinces many varieties of Islam. So there's not just one variety of Islam. Of course, it's a multifaceted religious persuasion. And while Belleville youth experience much of the racism, surveillance, and hostility from the police as their counterparts out in the banlieue, very famously in the banlieue, there's not the same sense of spatial isolation or marginalization or enemy in the towers of Place des Fêtes as there are out in the outskirts of Paris. Somehow this neighborhood works, and a kind of solidarity and diversity is really palpable in the streets and shops of Belleville. Similarly, in the Goutte d'Or, a polyglot mix of people has emerged over the last half century, fueled by sequent migrations. The Goutte d'Or, or drop of gold, is wedged into the 18th arrondissement between the train tracks of the Gare du Nord and the rising ground of Montmartre. The area built up in the 18th and 19th centuries around saltpeter production, animal hide tanning, and other really noxious industries. These industries attract workers, very poor workers from Belgium, from the Low Countries, from Alsace and Lorraine. But then beginning in the 1920s and increasingly after World War II, large numbers of immigrants from Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia began to settle the area. As such, the Goutte d'Or became a hotbed, really the hotbed, of North African anti-colonial independence activity, which the French state met with extensive surveillance, repression, and even extrajudicial murder. By the 1980s, the Maghrebi population began to age as younger generations moved to other areas within and outside of Paris. As more housing opportunities became available, a new wave of immigrants began settling into the neighborhood. So the beginning in the 1970s and picking up really in the 1980s and 90s, large numbers of immigrants have been coming into the Goutte d'Or from Senegal, Sierra Leone, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, and other West African countries. So today the Goutte d'Or comprises one of the most diverse communities in Europe. But there are worrisome signs again that gentrification is on the rise. And unlike previous successions where Algerian and Moroccan families aged out or got wealthier and moved out to larger housing in the suburbs, there's a looming threat of rapid displacement of working class African people by a wealthier and younger white Parisian class seeking cheaper rents. How this plays out remains to be seen, but decades of strong community organization and networks of immigrant solidarity suggest that the Goutte d'Or will not yield so readily to these transformations. Just checking my time. Okay. So what have I learned in the process of making images in these extraordinary places? And here I'll start to wrap this up. I would like to leave off with a few tentative findings with the caveat that I'm only in the early stages of what I think of as a long-term project. I see the Global Queens book as just the first in a series of such studies. Perhaps the most striking thing I've come to understand is that collectivities are difficult to forge in the cauldron of the global capitalist city. And when they do form, they are precious in their way. Just as often, though, one gets the sense that even as we dwell together, we dwell apart. While boundary crossing relations do fluoresce into existence, they are usually temporary and contingent, frequent but ephemeral, fragile in their way. Exceptions exist, of course, but the common experience of diversity very often remains apartness. This might seem surprising in the context of so-called liberal societies such as France and the United States, but recent political eruptions remind us that liberalism is a thin skein laid atop a roiling mess of liberal values and beliefs, hostilities against Jews, Muslims, and African migrants in France, or the white supremacist cry of blood and soil in the United States. At the same time, it's increasingly clear that social diversity is almost a precondition for a politics of love and care that moves beyond the boundaries of any one group and allows for the building of solidarity and the bulking of resistance. So the question remains, for me, can cities make a difference, right? Can they protect and expand values of diversity even when the nations that surround them lapse into xenophobia? Can they provide what sociologist Elijah Anderson calls the cosmopolitan canopy? After all, most cities were founded long before the nation states that contain them. They're older, right? They've been around a lot longer. For most of human history, cities, not nations, were the fundamental guarantors of the civitas, citizenship. But can cities guarantee inclusion in an era where nations govern questions of citizenship and where racism and bigotry have long enshrined in national policy? Can we forge a pathway for a citizenship that is once urban and global? I think we can, because I think cities are precisely those places where diverse interactions among people across lines of differences have shaped a rough sense of tolerance and a shared capacity for getting along in the conduct of everyday life. Not without various forms of inequality, of course, and not without pain and difficulty and uncertainty and misunderstanding, but a sensibility that can provide a bulwark against the rise of fascism, anti-Black racism, and hostility towards immigrants. In Jackson Heights, in Belleville, in Elmhurst, in the Goutte d'Or, contacts between people across these lines multiply over time as people encounter one another in daily life. And in the process, diverse groups come to see that despite their varied and often divergent trajectories, they have many common interests, and that by articulating these common interests, they can build local networks, institutions, and political associations, and they do this. Such associations allow groups to put stakes in the ground and to gain some measure of control over the destiny of their communities. But does this translate at scale is the question. How might unities and diversity scale up to the nation, for example, or even the global scale? For me, this raises a basic conundrum, and I'll be ending up with this conundrum. Are societies such as the US and France liberal cultures with undercurrents of conservatism? Or are they fundamentally illiberal cultures with pockets of tolerance and embrasure? In the US, there is a long and fraught history of acceptance of hyphenated identities, of conceptions of citizenship articulated between worlds in the breach, the Irish American, African American, Italian American, and so forth. At the same time, cries for cultural homogeneity erupt continually like some undigested morsel rotting in the guts of the body politic. The deranged exertions of white racial revanchism, the death rattle of the Confederacy, that failed state within a state that lies barely submerged under the gloss of American democratic institutions, and the principal engine of Trump's rise to power. And what of France? To be sure, the French notion of citizenship evinces a brittleness and rigidity that often forecloses hyphenated identities. Subsumed under the skin of Republican citizenship, with its promise of universal subject, lurks the profound, durable plaint of francité as the irreducible embodiment of French identity. And it's a francité that is inevitably mapped onto white skin and the racial prerogatives of normative political frame of the white citizen subject. The French state has faltered continually in an effort to reconcile these visions, as with the ludicrous efforts to ban burqas on summer beaches. Can Paris provide the counterweight to this civic conundrum? Can it outstretch its Frenchness? Can the great city provide safe haven for tolerance of difference in a rapidly changing Europe? What of New York? After all, Despite its reputation as an open, tolerant city, it's not only deeply fractious and parochial, it's also highly segregated by race. Indeed, New York City is one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. Cosmopolitanism, then, is far from a fixed condition or state of being, but rather a fragile, always incomplete project, always a world in the making. It is less an analytic or even descriptive category than a heuristic, a kind of contract or agreement, often tacit, frequently fugitive, always fungible, inchoate. In other words, it's up to all of us to build the cosmopolis. It's not just going to come unheralded. If we think about it, less as an end state than a political project, we can see it as a work in progress, a condition of constant emergence, a set of practices rather than ontologies, an iterative condition formed from routines and habits, feedback, amplification, mutual recognition of each other. After all, people in diverse communities like Jackson Heights and Belleville have had to craft ways of relating to one another from scratch in the course of their everyday lives. They've had to forge common causes, however fragile, however momentary, just at the price of doing business in a great metropolis. So I would argue, in the end, that this cosmopolis welling up from below is precisely what we need even to begin fathoming new modes of togetherness, weaving threads of solidarity across lines of difference, making way for emergent structures of feeling, bearing witness to injustice. It's through millions of small gestures, through these tentative connections, these routine encounters, that cosmopolitanism will spark into the world. Once emergent, it is this cosmopolitanism from below that opens up the space for imagining possibilities of the next city. And maybe, just maybe, this is enough to keep us hopeful. Thank you.